She signed it without flinching. That's the part Dante Vercelli couldn't shake. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of building something that looked like a life. And Elena Marlowe signed those papers like she was closing a tab at a restaurant. No hesitation, no tremor in her hand. Just the quiet scratch of a pen across the signature line, the soft slide of paper across cold marble, and then those 7 words low, almost gentle, which somehow made them worse. You finally gave me exactly what I needed. Dante had expected tears. He'd braced for an argument, or silence, or even one final look that begged him to change his mind. He'd been ready for all of it. What he had not been ready for was the small, controlled smile at the corner of her mouth as she pulled her hand back from the papers. She'd just closed a deal she'd been waiting years to finalize. He opened his mouth. Then the first headlights swept across the courthouse window, turned, one black sedan idling at the curb, then a second pulling in behind it, then 5 more. Then the low, bone-rattling growl of motorcycles and the heavy crunch of armored vehicles taking positions at every corner of the block. Men stepped out with quiet efficiency, adjusting their lapels, scanning the perimeter, not rushing, not shouting, moving the way men move when they already know they've won, before the first word is spoken. Dante's lead guard, a barrel-chested veteran named Gio, who had taken 2 bullets for Dante in the last decade, reached for his sidearm, then stopped. His hand dropped. His jaw tightened. He turned back to Dante slowly, and his voice came out stripped of everything except fact. "They're not here for you, boss." The lead vehicle, a matte black Escalade with no plates, rolled to a stop directly in front of the courthouse steps. The door opened. An elderly man climbed out, unhurried, moving with the kind of stillness that doesn't belong to soldiers. Belongs to men who give orders to soldiers. He was somewhere past, 70, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than the courthouse's monthly utilities. He looked up the steps, past Dante's men, past Dante himself, and fixed his eyes on Elena. "Miss Marlowe," he said. His voice carried perfectly in the cold air. "Your family has been waiting years to bring you home." Dante stood completely still. The only sound was the low idle of 20 engines and the distant moan of Chicago wind cutting between the buildings. He turned to look at his wife, his ex-wife, who was already moving toward the steps, with the calm of someone walking toward a car they'd called 20 minutes ago. "Elena." His voice came out harder than he intended. "What the hell is this?" She paused at the top of the steps, but didn't turn all the way around. Just enough that he could see her profile. The fluorescent courthouse light caught the side of her face, and for one unguarded second, something crossed her expression that wasn't quite sorrow and wasn't quite relief. It was somewhere between the two, the look of someone who has been holding their breath underwater. For so long they'd almost forgotten what breathing felt like. "Go home, Dante," she said. Quiet, tired, like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times and was relieved it was finally here. Then she walked down the steps toward the old man, who extended his arm as naturally as if he'd been escorting her whole life. Dante's right hand came up without thinking. "Nobody moves," he said, loud enough for his men to hear. "Nobody touches her. Nobody touches them." He was already descending the steps. "What family?" "Elena doesn't have family. She told me her entire family was gone." The old man turned to face him fully for the first time. He didn't look threatened. He didn't look amused. He looked like a man studying an architectural flaw in a building he'd known for years was poorly constructed. "She told you what she needed to tell you," Limsan said. "My name is Roman Marlowe. I am Elena's uncle, and the acting head of the Marlowe Syndicate." Dante stopped walking. The Marlowe Syndicate. He'd heard the name exactly twice in his entire career, both times from men who were dead within a year of saying it. The Marlowe organization had supposedly ceased to exist sometime in the early 2000s, dissolved, absorbed, dismantled. Nobody talked about them because there was nothing left to talk about. Or so every piece of intelligence Dante had ever received had told him. "The Marlowe Syndicate hasn't operated in 20 years, Dante said. "That's what we needed people to believe," Roman said simply. He glanced at Elena beside him, then back at Dante. "She is our last surviving direct heir. She has been under our protection for 12 years. Tonight, that protection becomes visible." Dante looked at Elena, really looked at her. The way he hadn't in probably 3 years, he realized, with a sourness in his chest that tasted like shame. She was watching him steadily, her hands loose at her sides, her expression unreadable, the same expression she'd worn for most of their marriage. He'd always thought it meant she was detached, indifferent, somewhere else even when she was in the same room. He understood now with a clarity that was almost physical, that he had been wrong about what that expression meant. "Get in the car, Elena." Roman said, not unkindly, "Wait." Dante stepped forward. 3 of Roman's men adjusted their positions fractionally, not drawing weapons, just redistributing weight, the way wolves reorient without making a sound. Dante stopped. He kept his eyes on Elena. "You don't owe me an explanation, but you owe me the truth. 5 years. Were any of it real?" Elena held his gaze for a long moment. "All of it was real," she said. "That's what made it hard." She got in the car. The convoy didn't rush. Simply gathered itself, motorcycles easing forward first, armored vehicles falling into formation, and moved down the street with the quiet authority of something that has never needed to hurry because it has never needed to worry. Dante stood on the courthouse steps and watched the taillights until they disappeared around the corner. Gio appeared at his shoulder. "What do you want to do?" Dante stared at the empty street for another 3 seconds. "Drive," he said. "I need to think." He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the study of his North Shore mansion, with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink, running the previous 5 years through his memory, like crime scene footage, looking for the things he'd missed, the details that had been in front of him the whole time and hadn't registered. And there were things. That was what kept him in the chair until the gray winter light started coming through the windows. There were things. The year a Moretti family underboss named Carlucci had arranged a meeting with Dante at a restaurant in Logan Square and called it off 4 hours before, citing a family emergency. Dante had written it off. 6 weeks later, he'd heard through back channels that Carlucci had died in what was ruled a boating accident in Lake Michigan. He hadn't thought twice about it. Carlucci had enemies from here to New York. 2 years into the marriage, Dante had survived a car bombing that should have killed him. His security chief at the time, a man named DeWitt, had rerouted his morning route at the last minute, claiming he'd received a tip about traffic. DeWitt had been vague about the source. Dante had been grateful enough not to push. DeWitt had retired the following year on what Dante had assumed was his pension. 3 different informants over 5 years had been found dead before they could testify against Vercelli operations. Each time, Dante had assumed it was his own people handling business. He'd never asked which of his captains had ordered it, because in his world, you didn't always ask. Sometimes you just accepted that things got handled. He sat there in the gray morning light and started to understand that not one of those things had been handled by his people. Someone had been running interference on his behalf, on a schedule he'd never seen, with a level of access to information that he hadn't understood his wife possessed. He thought about where Elena had been during the weeks each of those events occurred. He thought about her quiet disappearances to visit what she'd called a college friend in the city. He thought about the phone she kept in the drawer of her nightstand that he'd assumed was an old personal cell she never quite got around to deactivating. He picked up his own phone and called his intelligence director, a cautious, methodical man named Harris, who had worked for the Vercelli organization for 15 years. "I need everything you can get me on the Marlowe syndicate," Dante said when Harris picked up. "Don't use our usual channels. Use the ones we keep for government-level inquiries. And Harris, if this traces back to any sitting federal official, I need to know that first." "How fast?" "Yesterday." He hung up and finally drank the whiskey. Harris called back at noon. "This is complicated," was the first thing he said, which from Harris, who communicated in flat declarative sentences, was the equivalent of screaming. "Talk." The Marlowe Syndic didn't dissolve. It restructured, changed the visible architecture, moved the senior leadership off any public-facing documents, and spent roughly 15 years building what looks from the outside like a clean financial management company. But the underlying ownership structure, the people actually controlling major accounts, brokerage positions, and private security contracts, it reads like a shadow government for the Eastern Seaboard organized crime infrastructure. Dante said nothing. They have relationships with at least 3 sitting federal judges, 2 senior intelligence consultants, and one individual currently occupying a mid-level position in a Senate committee that oversees organized crime prosecution. I say mid-level loosely. The man is effectively unreachable. And Elena Marlowe. A pause. Elena Marlowe was born Elena Cosima Marlowe, daughter of Victor Marlowe, who was the eldest son of the original Marlowe patriarch, Augusto Marlowe. Victor and his wife died in 2012, officially ruled a traffic accident. Elena was 24. She was the only direct descendant of Augusto Marlowe to survive that year. Her uncle, Roman Marlowe, was managing the syndicate on a caretaker basis pending her return. Dante was quiet for a moment. What do you mean, pending her return? There's a succession charter, boss. It's old, probably dating to sometime in the 90s when Augusto was formalizing the organization. Elena Marlowe is the designated primary heir. Roman's authority is explicitly temporary in the charter structure. He can't make permanent decisions without her signature, which is why he came last night. My read? Yes. Something changed. Something put the timeline in motion. Harris paused. There's one more thing. There are surveillance records, partial, from 3 sources I trust, showing Elena meeting separately with representatives of the Falcone family in Detroit, someone connected to the Cabrini Financial Group, and an individual who appears to work for a private intelligence firm connected to former intelligence assets. All of these meetings took place during your marriage. None of them were visible. Dante set the phone down without hanging up and stared at the far wall for a long count of 10. Then he picked it back up. She was protecting me, he said. Not a question, he said it the way you say a thing when you've been running from understanding it and your legs have finally given out. Harris was quiet for a moment. That's my read of the pattern. Yes. She wasn't running operations against you. She was running interference around you, keeping threats from reaching the point where you'd have to fight them. 5 years. For 5 years, Dante ended the call. He sat with that for a long time, the specific gut-hollowing weight of understanding that someone had been protecting you at great personal cost, in complete silence, while you were too busy being angry at them for being distant to notice what they were absorbing on your behalf. Thought about the arguments he'd started, the accusations he'd made, emotional absence, coldness, secrecy. He thought about how many times he'd sat across the dinner table from Elena Marlowe and felt like she was somewhere else, not understanding that where she was everywhere at once, handling threats he didn't even know had his name on them. He'd given her exactly what she needed. An exit, clean and legal, right before her family came to bring her home. The bitterness of it sat in his chest like something swallowed wrong. He found Silas Creed that evening. Silas was Dante's most senior advisor, had been for 8 years. Former lawyer, current strategist. The kind of mind that could disassemble a complex operation and rebuild it before anyone noticed the pieces had moved. Dante trusted him with things he didn't trust to anyone else, including some of his own captains. Silas was at his private office on the 14th floor of a building in the financial district that was listed under a corporate name, with no visible connection to the Vercelli organization. Dante didn't call ahead. He took the private elevator with 2 of his men and walked through the door without knocking. Silas was at his desk. He looked up without visible surprise, which was either the confidence of a man with a clean conscience or the composure of a man who had been expecting this moment for a while. Dante had always thought it was the former. Sitting in the chair across the desk, watching Silas set down his pen with that same practiced calm, he began to wonder if he'd been wrong about that too. Tell me about your relationship with Matteo Vercelli, Dante said. The room temperature dropped. Silas held very still for exactly 1 second, not long enough to be visible to most people. Long enough for Dante. He'd spent 20 years reading rooms for a living. Your father has been dead for 11 years, Dante. That's not what I asked. Silas folded his hands on the desk. His expression shifted into something carefully neutral, and Dante recognized it because it was the same expression Elena had worn on the courthouse steps, the expression of a person deciding how much to give up. I'd be careful about what you're implying, Silas said. I'm not implying anything. Dante's voice stayed even. I'm asking you directly. Was my father in contact with you at any point during my marriage to Elena Marlowe? The silence stretched for 4 seconds. Then Silas said, You've been talking to the Marlowe people. Answer the question. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his folded hands. When he looked back up, something in his face had changed, not guilt exactly, but the exhausted acknowledgement of a man who's been waiting for a door to open and has finally heard the knock. The situation, Silas said carefully, is significantly more complicated than you know. Dante leaned forward slightly, then started talking. Before Silas could say another word, Dante's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize, blocked, routed through at least 2 relay points based on the display pattern his security team had taught him to read. He answered it. A voice he hadn't heard in 11 years said, "Hello, son." The room tilted. Silas watched Dante's face go through several things, very quickly: shock, then fury, then something colder and more dangerous than either. Matteo Vercelli was alive. "I need you to listen," Matteo said, "and I need you to not do anything stupid in the next 30 seconds. The man in that room with you, don't touch him. Not yet. He's more useful to you, alive, and I have information you need before this goes any further." Dante stood up slowly from the chair. "You've been missing for 11 years, Dante said. His voice came out remarkably steady, considering everything happening behind his eyes. "I've been managing from a distance," Matteo said, "the way it needed to be managed. I'm reaching out now because the timeline has accelerated. Roman Marlowe has made his move. Your former wife is about to take control of an organization that will make the Vercelli Empire look like a neighborhood operation. And what is that to you?" A pause. "It's a problem," Matteo said, "for both of us. I suggest we find a way to discuss it before Elena Marlowe decides whether she wants you as an asset or a liability." The line went dead. Dante stood in the middle of the 14th floor office with his phone in his hand, and the quiet certainty that whatever he had thought his life was, whatever story he had been telling himself about power and loyalty and control had just been turned completely inside out. Silas watched him from across the desk and said nothing. Outside, Chicago moved through its evening the way it always did, indifferent, enormous, full of lives that had no idea what had just shifted in a room on the 14th floor of an anonymous financial district building. Dante looked at Silas. "You're going to tell me everything," he said. "All of it, from the beginning." Silas took a slow breath. "You should sit down," he said. "This is going to take a while." And somewhere across the city, in a secured suite on the upper floor of a building whose address appeared nowhere in any public record, Elena Marlowe sat across from her uncle Roman, listening to a briefing on the current state of the organization she had just agreed to lead. On the table between them was a photograph she had kept in the lining of her travel bag for 5 years. Her and Dante, a random Tuesday in their 2nd year, laughing at something neither of them would have been able to remember afterward. She looked at it once. Then she turned it face down and kept listening. There was work to do, and somewhere in the infrastructure of a criminal empire, she'd spent years secretly managing from the inside. A war was already beginning, one that the people starting it had no idea she'd been preparing for. Since the day she first walked into Dante Vercelli's world with a false name and a real plan, she had just needed him to sign the papers first. Silas talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Dante didn't interrupt him once. He sat in the chair across the desk with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and he listened the way he'd learned to listen in his 20s, when his father was still teaching him the business with his whole body, taking in not just the words but the pauses between them, the places where Silas's voice tightened, the moments when his eyes moved slightly left before settling back. Silas told him about the first contact with Matteo Vercelli, which had happened not 11 years ago when Matteo supposedly died, but 14 years ago when Dante was still consolidating the North Side operation, and his father was supposedly stepping back from daily operations due to health. Matteo had approached Silas privately, outside any Vercelli organizational structure, and offered him a simple proposition: stay close to Dante, report significant developments, and receive compensation through a channel that would never appear in any Vercelli accounting. Silas told him this the way men confess things they've been carrying too long, with a kind of flat exhaustion, like the weight of the secret was actually heavier than the consequences of saying it out loud. "Why?" Dante said. First word he'd spoken in nearly 3 hours. Money, initially. Silas didn't look away. He'd made a decision somewhere in the first 10 minutes that he was going to be honest, and he was executing that decision with the same precision he brought to everything else. And then, because your father convinced me the arrangement protected you, that he was running intelligence from outside to keep threats from reaching your level. He was running intelligence. That's what I believed. And Elena? Silas was quiet for a moment. I didn't know she was a Marlowe. Not at first. But when I found out about 2 years into your marriage, your father instructed me to help him manage the situation. Manage it how? Another pause, shorter this time. By making sure you never fully trusted her. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building's ventilation system, something clicked and hummed. Say that again, Dante said. Matteo believed Elena's presence in your life was a structural risk. He didn't know her full identity at that point, but he knew she had connections he couldn't trace, and that made her dangerous to his plans. He wanted her isolated. If she was isolated from you, if you kept emotional distance, if trust between you eroded, she would either leave on her own or become vulnerable. Dante stood up, not quickly. The way a man stands when he needs his body to do something because his mind is currently somewhere it can't function from. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. 14 floors down, Chicago was doing what it always did, indifferent, enormous, full of people living inside lives that had nothing to do with any of this. What did you do? Dante said. Flat. Not quite a question. Specific conversations, timed carefully. Silas's voice didn't shake, but it had lost all its professional smoothness. What was left underneath was just a tired man in his 60s reading from the ledger of choices he'd made. When Elena tried to raise concerns about certain operations, I reframed them to you as her being controlling. When she pulled back emotionally, after a significant argument, which was a pattern, Matteo had actually engineered by feeding me information to pass to you that would provoke specific responses from her. I characterized it as indifference. Disloyalty. Dante turned from the window. The argument about the Donnelly contract. Silas met his eyes. Matteo knew Elena had concerns about Donnelly's federal exposure. She was right to have them. I told you, she was trying to undermine your judgment because she didn't respect the operation. I didn't speak to her for 6 days after that. I know. She slept in the guest room for 2 weeks. I know, Dante. Dante walked back to the chair but didn't sit. He put both hands on the back of it and stood there, and the silence in the room had the specific density of something that can't be taken back. How many times? He said. Silas didn't answer immediately. How many times did you do this? Over 5 years. Silas looked at the surface of his desk. More than I can give you an exact count of. It became systematic. Matteo had a read on both of you. He knew what would land. He was precise. Dante picked up the chair and threw it across the room. It hit the far wall and left a gouge in the plaster and clattered to the floor, and the 2 men Dante had brought with him took a half step forward before Dante held up one hand without looking at them. Stopped. The room resettled into silence. Where is he? Dante said. I don't know his exact location. I have a contact number. It routes through multiple points. Give it to me. Dante, give me the number, Silas. He didn't call Matteo back that night. He needed to think before he spoke, and he needed information before he thought. He sent Gio to sit on Silas, not detained, not threatened, just watched. And he drove himself back to the mansion, which he never did. And the act of being alone in the car, with the city moving past the windows, was its own kind of violence. He kept seeing Elena's face on the courthouse steps, kept hearing her voice saying all of it was real, kept calculating the math of what that meant against everything Silas had just laid out for him. She had been protecting him from a war his own father was engineering, while his own father was using his most trusted advisor to make him distrust the one person who was actually on his side. And Dante, who prided himself on reading people, who had built an empire on his ability to detect deception and loyalty, had sat across from his wife for 5 years and felt the distance between them and blamed her for it. He got to the mansion and went directly to the study. He poured whiskey and didn't drink it. Again. He was building a collection of glasses he couldn't bring himself to finish. His phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Harris again. There's been movement, Harris said. The Marlowe convoy has split. Roman's people have taken 2 positions, one in the Gold Coast, one on the south lakefront. High security footprint. We're reading as Elena's new operational base. Both locations. She's already setting up. It looks like she had it pre-arranged. These locations weren't acquired last night. The leases on both properties are 18 months old. Dante absorbed that. 18 months ago, Elena had been sneaking across from him at dinner, talking about whether they should repaint the front hallway. There's something else, Harris said. We intercepted partial communication from a group we've been tracking loosely for about 6 months. They call themselves the Sarto faction. Mid-size operation, Eastern affiliations. Nothing we ever took seriously as a threat. They know Elena is alive and public. The communication suggests they had people embedded who believed she was dead, and her appearance last night triggered a contingency. What kind of contingency? The language is they want her eliminated before she takes formal control of the Marlowe inheritance. Apparently, she's more dangerous to them as a leader than the Marlowe organizations is as a headless structure. When? The communication doesn't give a timeline, which means it could be now. Dante set down the untouched whiskey glass. I need eyes on both her locations. Already moving, Harris said. Then carefully, boss. If we move to protect her, we are inserting ourselves into a Marlowe succession conflict. That has implications. I know what it has. I just want to make sure. She's not their target because of who she is to them, Dante said. She's their target because someone doesn't want her to take power, which means someone benefits from the Marlowe organization staying headless. I want to know who. He ended the call and stood in the study and thought about Elena in a secured suite somewhere on the Gold Coast with security he didn't control. Facing a threat she may or may not know was already in motion, and the sensation in his chest was something he hadn't felt in years, a specific, grinding helplessness that he absolutely hated. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd been given by Silas. It rang 4 times. I was wondering how long you'd wait, Matteo said. You've got about 90 seconds to tell me something worth hearing before I find where you are and have a different kind of conversation, Dante said. Start talking. A slight pause. Then, and this was the thing that set Dante's teeth on edge, his father laughed. Not cruelly. Almost warmly, the way he used to laugh when Dante was 12 and had said something unexpectedly sharp. You sound like you did when you were 23, Matteo said, right before you took apart the Bellini operation. All that controlled fury. It was always your best quality. Don't. All right. The warmth dropped. What replaced it was something more precise. The Sarto faction has a contract out on Elena Marlowe. I know, because I was the one who initially introduced them to the concept of her value as a target before I understood the full scope of what she represented. Dante went very still. You put a contract on my wife, on a Marlowe heir who I believed was using proximity to you to position the Marlowe organization for an eastern expansion that would threaten Vercelli territory. That was the intelligence I was operating from. And now I have different intelligence. Now I know that Elena's plan was never eastward expansion. It was consolidation and legitimization. She wants to take the Marlowe operation clean, convert it, build a legal entity, step away from the criminal infrastructure. A brief pause, which is actually far more dangerous to certain people than expansion would have been. Dangerous to you. Dangerous to several people, including some with government connections who have been quietly profiting from Marlowe's shadow structure for a decade. If Elena legitimizes, those arrangements get exposed. There are people in very stable positions who cannot afford that. Dante walked a slow line across the study. Why are you telling me this? Because I made a miscalculation, Matteo said, and for the first time in the conversation his voice had something in it that might have been, on a man with a fuller conscience, remorse. I believed Elena was a threat to you. I acted on that belief. I was wrong about what she was doing, and I was wrong about who she was doing it for. The contract I put in motion, I can't simply pull it back. The Sarto faction has their own reasons to want her dead now. It has moved past my control. If you think I'm going to help you clean up your mess by, I think, Matteo said sharply, that the woman you spent 5 years with is currently in a building with good security and insufficient intelligence on what's actually coming for her. And I think you have 48 hours before the Sarto faction makes a move they've been planning for 3 weeks. And I think whatever you feel about me, and I know what you feel about me, you are not going to let her die, because you needed to win an argument with your father first. The line hummed. I'll send you what I have on the Sarto operation, Matteo said. What you do with it is your decision. It always has been. The call ended. Dante stood in the study with the phone in his hand, and his father's voice still sitting in the room like something with its own weight. He pulled up a contact, typed a short message, and sent it. Then he put on his coat and walked out. He drove to the Gold Coast location at 1 a.m. and parked half a block down and watched the building from the car. His own security team had eyes in the area. He could see one of Harris's people in a parked sedan near the corner without meaning to, which meant Roman's people had almost certainly made them too. The Marlowe's security presence was less visible, but demonstrably better, which irritated him more than it probably should have. He was still sitting there when his passenger door opened. He hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen approach. The door just opened, and Elena sat down in the passenger seat, with her coat pulled tight and her hair down, which he hadn't seen in years. She always kept it back. She looked at the building they were both now facing and said nothing for a moment. Your man 3 cars back, she said. He adjusts his rearview mirror every 4 minutes. It's a tell. I'll mention it. Your father called you. Not a question. Dante looked at her profile. How do you know that? Because you drove here instead of calling. You only drive places when you've had a conversation that made you need to move. She turned to look at him. In the low light from the street, her eyes were very dark and very tired. What did he say? He says he put a contract on you. Says he can't pull it back. The Sarto people have their own motivation now. She nodded slowly, like she was receiving information she'd already calculated might be coming, and just needed the confirmation. I know about the Sarto faction, she said. Since when? Since about 4 months ago. We've been tracking their positioning, and you weren't going to. He stopped, reorganized. You knew there was a threat on your life, and you went ahead with the divorce anyway. The divorce was the safest move I had. If I stayed legally connected to you, you were a vector. Anyone who wanted access to me could move through you. She looked back at the building. I was trying to protect you from becoming a target. You were protecting me, Dante said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Again, old habit. The words landed without any drama, which made them land harder. Elena. He waited until she looked at him. Silas told me what he did, what my father had him do, the arguments, the all of it. Her expression didn't change dramatically. Something shifted behind her eyes, but she kept her face steady, and he recognized it now. He finally recognized what that steadiness cost her, because he'd spent an entire evening learning the shape of what had been done to them both. I know about Silas, she said. How long? About a year in, maybe 14 months. She looked at her hands in her lap. I couldn't tell you without proof, and I couldn't get proof without tipping Silas, that I knew, which would tip Matteo. So I worked around it. You worked around your husband's closest advisor, actively destroying your marriage. I kept us both alive, she said, with the first edge that had come into her voice. That was what I had to prioritize. I'm sorry that she stopped. Took a breath. I am sorry that the cost of that was what it was. To you. To us. Dante looked out the windshield at the building. A light was on in the 4th floor. He had no idea if it was her room. Roman knows I'm here, he said. Roman knew before you parked. A ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile. He's not happy about it. I need to brief you on what Matteo sent me. Turned fully to face him. He sent you intelligence. On the Sarto timeline. 48 hours, maybe less. Her jaw tightened fractionally. Send it to my secure line. Harris has the number, don't look surprised, Dante. I've had a relationship with Harris for 3 years. He just didn't know which way it ran. She reached for the door handle. We'll coordinate through Roman. Elena. She stopped. I threw Silas's chair through a wall tonight, he said. She looked at him. Just the chair? So far. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she opened the door. Get some sleep. You're going to need to be sharp in the next 48 hours, and you look like you haven't slept since the courthouse. She stepped out of the car, and he watched her walk back toward the building unhurried, straight back, disappearing past the security perimeter with the ease of someone who had been navigating hostile territory their entire adult life. Dante sat in the car for another minute. Then his phone lit up with an incoming file from Matteo's relay, number 53 pages of operational intelligence on the Sardo faction. Their personnel, their planned approach vectors, and buried at page 41, a single piece of information that made the base of his skull go cold. The Sardo faction didn't just have a contract on Elena. They had a secondary target, and the secondary target's name was Dante Vercelli. His father had not mentioned that part. Dante read page 41 3 times. Not because the words were complicated, because his brain kept sliding off them the way you slide off a wet surface, reaching for purchase, finding none, starting over. The secondary target designation was written in the same flat operational language as the rest of the document, tucked between a personnel roster and a logistics timeline, like it was administrative detail rather than a death sentence. Secondary, D. Vercelli. Rationale. Elimination removes primary protection vector and destabilizes Vercelli infrastructure during transition period. Timing, concurrent with primary action, or within 72 hours following. His father had sent him 53 pages of intelligence on a contract that included his own name and hadn't mentioned it, had told him about Elena's exposure, walked him through the Sardo timeline, expressed what had sounded almost like remorse, and left out the part where Dante himself was scheduled to die in the same operation. He sat in the parked car for another full minute, holding the phone, and thought about what that meant. It meant one of two things. Either Matteo genuinely didn't know his son was a listed target, which would require a level of operational distance from the Sardo faction that seemed inconsistent with the depth of detail in the rest of the document. Or Matteo knew and chose not to say it, and had reasons for that choice that Dante hadn't yet mapped out. Neither option was comfortable. One was incompetence. The other was something worse. He called Harris. I need a full workup on Matteo Vercelli's current operational relationships, Dante said when Harris picked up on the second ring. Not historical. Current. Who he's talking to, what accounts are moving, any property or shell activity in the last 6 months. Use everything. That's going to take time. You have until morning. He paused, and pull the Sardo file alongside it. I want to know if there's any financial overlap between Matteo's current network and Sardo's known backers. He ended the call, looked at the building for another moment, then started the car and drove. He didn't go back to the mansion. He went to a secondary property on the northwest side, a quiet building registered under a corporate name, used occasionally for sensitive meetings. He kept a room there that nobody knew about except Gio, and he used it now, because whatever was coming in the next 48 hours, he needed to think in a space that wasn't already compromised by everything Silas had done inside it. He didn't sleep. He sat at the small table with Matteo's document open on his phone and worked through it page by page, cross-referencing against his own memory of the last 6 months. The Sardo faction had personnel positioned in 3 locations across the city. Their primary approach vectors were mapped to both of Elena's operational addresses, which meant they had recent intelligence on the Marlowe security setup intelligence that had been gathered after last night's courthouse appearance. That was fast. Uncomfortably fast for an organization that had supposedly been running on a contingency plan. At 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. Not a call, a message from a number he didn't have saved. The message was 4 words. We need to meet. He stared at it, then typed back, who is this? The response came in under 10 seconds. Someone who knew your mother. Dante put the phone face down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he picked it back up. Where, he typed. The address was a diner in Pilsen that was open all night and appeared, on arrival, to contain exactly 3 customers, an elderly man at the counter, a woman in her 40s reading something on a tablet, and a person in a gray coat in the last booth, who had their back to the door and their hands around a coffee cup. Dante sat across from her and took a moment to place the face. She was somewhere in her early 60s, composed, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm but from discipline. He'd seen her once before, he realized years ago, at a Vercelli family dinner his father had hosted. She'd been introduced as a financial consultant. He hadn't thought about her since. My name is Carla Voss, she said. I was your mother's closest friend from the time she was 19 until the day she died, and I have something she left for you. Dante said nothing. He watched her hands, her eyes, the slight tension in her shoulders. Your mother didn't die of a stroke, Carla said. She died because she found something in your father's private records that she wasn't supposed to find, and she made the mistake of telling him she knew. The diner's ambient noise coffee machine, low music, the distant clatter of a kitchen continued exactly as before. Dante's breathing stayed even. His hands stayed still. These were choices, not states. Keep going, he said. Your mother discovered that Matteo had been running a secondary operation for nearly 20 years, completely separate from the Vercelli organization. Private arrangement with a financial broker network that was funneling money through several layers of legitimate business into accounts controlled by what she described in her notes as a third party she couldn't identify. Carla reached into her coat and placed a small envelope on the table. It was sealed, old enough that the paper had yellowed slightly at the corners. She wrote everything down, gave it to me the week before she died with instructions to hold it until it was needed. Dante looked at the envelope. His mother's handwriting was on the front. His name, nothing else. He didn't pick it up yet. Why now, he said. Because Elena Marlowe is alive in public, which means the succession clock is running, which means Matteo is going to move faster than he's moved in a decade. And because the third party your mother couldn't identify. Carla wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I identified them 6 months ago. Took me 11 years because they are very well hidden. They operate through the Sardo faction. The pieces didn't fall into place gradually. Crashed. Matteo isn't working against the Sardo faction, Dante said. Matteo built the Sardo faction, Carla said. Or rather, he built the financial architecture that funds them. They aren't a competing organization. They're his instrument. He created them as a deniable operation. Approximately 8 years ago, an entity he could deploy without it, tracing back to the Vercelli name. Dante picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. He turned it over in his hands once and set it back down. The intelligence he sent me tonight, Dante said. His voice had gone flat in the way it went, when he was working very hard to stay functional. The Sarto file was likely designed to position you, to give you enough information to act, but not enough to understand who you were actually acting against. Carla's eyes were steady on him. If you move against the Sardo faction with the intelligence he gave you, you will be dismantling a structure he can rebuild in 6 months. But more immediately, you'll be moving on his timeline, in a direction he can predict, which puts you exactly where he needs you when he makes his actual play. What's his actual play? Elena's inheritance requires a formal declaration of succession within the Marlowe charter structure. There's a physical document, the original charter, held in a secured location that Roman Marlowe controls. That document is destroyed or stolen before Elena formally signs the succession declaration. The inheritance goes into a legal dispute that could take years to resolve. During that period, the Marlowe organization has no legitimate head. Roman's temporary authority lapses, and the whole structure becomes vulnerable to acquisition. She paused. Your father intends to acquire it, not for the Vercelli organization that's dead, and I think he knows it. With enough of the Marlowe infrastructure, he doesn't need the Vercelli name anymore. Dante looked at the envelope again, at his name in his mother's handwriting. How did she find out? He said. His voice, just for that one sentence, had something in it that wasn't the Vercelli organization's head. It was a son asking a question he'd needed to ask for 11 years. She found a set of transfer records in his private office. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for an insurance document. She saw the amounts and the routing structures, and she knew enough, from years of living adjacent to how this world operates, to understand what she was seeing. Carla's voice softened fractionally. She was frightened, but she was very clear-headed about it. She didn't panic. She documented everything, gave it to me, and then she confronted him. A pause. She believed he still loved her enough to tell the truth. The diner's coffee machine cycled. Somewhere in the kitchen, something was set down on metal. She was wrong, Dante said. Yes. He sat with that for a moment. Just sat with it, the way you have to sometimes sit with a thing that is too large to move around in a normal amount of time. Then he opened the envelope. His mother's handwriting inside was neat and unhurried, which told him she'd written it when she was calm, rather than panicked, had thought about what she wanted to say and then said it without rushing. It was 3 pages, dense with specifics. Account numbers, routing codes, dates, names of subsidiary entities. The last paragraph was different from the rest, in tone, less documentation, more letter. Dante, if you're reading this, then something happened to me that I couldn't prevent. I don't want you to spend time on grief that could go toward understanding. What matters is this. Your father is not what he presented himself to be, and neither was the empire he handed you. You built something real on top of it. I watched you. And whatever else is true, that part was yours. Don't let what he is define what you become. The woman and I believe there will be a woman, because you have always needed someone who could match. You trust her more than you trust the instinct to control everything. That instinct is his, not yours. You're better than he is. I always knew that. Dante folded the letter and put it in his inside coat pocket. He looked at Carla Voss across the table, and something in his face had shifted in the way. Faces shift when the last supporting wall of a structure has come down, not collapsed, just fundamentally changed shape. I need to reach Elena, he said now. Not through Roman. I have a direct contact, Carla said. She slid a card across the table. A number, handwritten. She knows I exist. She's known about me for about 2 years. She found me through your mother's estate records. She didn't reach out because she was waiting to see if I would. Dante looked at the card. She knew about my mother. She suspected. She didn't have proof until about 6 months ago. Carla held his gaze. She was trying to get you the truth, without detonating everything prematurely. The divorce was partly that, getting herself legally separated from you before the full picture emerged, so that when it did, you'd have room to respond without being encumbered by the marriage structure. She was protecting my ability to act, Dante said slowly. She was protecting you from being blindsided while you were still legally entangled with a target. Dante stood up. He picked up Carla's card. Then he stopped, standing at the table, and something occurred to him that hit with the specific, nauseating quality of a realization arriving too late. If Matteo sent me the Sardo intelligence to position me, he said, then he knew I'd show up at Elena's location tonight. Carla's expression shifted. And if he's running the Sardo faction, Dante continued, voice dropping, then he already knows where she is. Carla stood up fast. Dante was already calling Gio before he reached the door. Gio picked up on the first ring. Get eyes on the Gold Coast location right now, Dante said, moving through the diner toward the exit. And the South Lakefront. Both. I need confirmation Elena is still in the building, and I need it in the next 3 minutes. On it, Gio stopped. A beat. Boss. I'm getting something from the South Lakefront team. There's a longer pause, and in the pause, Dante could hear muffled radio traffic. Talk to me. There's a fire. South Lakefront property. It went up fast accelerant, is what they're saying. Our guys on the perimeter got pushed back. Marlowe security is already pulling people out, but Dante pushed through the diner door into the cold air. Is she in that building? We can't confirm. Our read was she was in the Gold Coast location, but she may have moved. Dante, I can't get a confirmation on Elena's location. He was already at his car. Gold Coast, he said. Hit every contact we have. I need to know if Roman's people are responding to the fire or staying in position. He got in and drove. He ran 2 red lights and didn't see them. His mind was running the map, South Lakefront burning, which meant either Elena had moved there after leaving his car and was inside a building currently on fire, or the fire was a diversion, and the actual operation was hitting the Gold Coast location, while Marlowe security split to respond. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number, different from the one that had texted him earlier. This one had a photograph attached. He stopped at a light and opened it. Photograph was of Silas Creed, bound to a chair in a room Dante didn't recognize, holding up a handwritten sign the way hostage photographs make people hold signs, and on the sign in Silas's cramped, precise handwriting were 2 lines. The charter location has been compromised. Roman doesn't know yet. Dante stared at the photograph. Below it, a text message from the same number. Your father says thank you for delivering yourself to the right position. He says you always were efficient. The light turned green. Dante sat through it. Someone behind him eventually honked. He didn't hear it. Matteo had used the Carla meeting, or had known about it, or had engineered it to get Dante moving toward Elena's location at the precise moment the Sardo operation launched. Dante had driven to Elena's building, sat outside it, spoken to her, and in doing so had confirmed her active location to anyone watching. Then Carla's information had sent him running toward a phone call that pulled his attention to the South Lakefront fire while the charter location was hit. He was not the rescue, he was the bait. He had led them directly to her. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number he recognized, Elena's direct line, the one from Carla's card that he hadn't even had time to use yet. He answered. Her voice was tight and fast. The charter location has been hit. Roman's people got there, but the document is gone. 50 seconds ago. A breath. Someone tracked the location through a surveillance feed that ran through your security network. Dante, whoever accessed it, used your credentials. It wasn't me. I know. And something in how quickly she said that the immediate, unqualified certainty cut through everything else in the car. It was Silas. He had your access codes. Your father has the charter. Dante's jaw tightened until it ached. Without the charter, he said, I can't complete the succession. The Marlowe organization has no legal head. Everything Roman has been holding together for 12 years goes into dispute. Her voice stayed controlled, but he could hear what the control was costing her, a faint thinness at the edges, the sound of someone holding a structure together with their hands while it tries to fall. We have maybe 12 hours before Matteo files the legal challenge. After that, it becomes a years-long process, and the whole organization is vulnerable. Dante sat in the car at the green light, with the cold settling into everything. Can you get another copy? He said. The original charter is the only legally binding document in the succession structure. Augusto built it that way, intentionally, single-document succession to prevent internal disputes. There's no copy. A brief silence. Matteo knew that. He's known the charter structure for years. He's been planning this for years, Dante said. Yes. The car behind him honked again. He pulled through the intersection. Elena. He kept his voice even because that was all he had left to offer in this particular moment. I need you to know something. Later, she said. No, Dante. Her voice dropped, lost the operational edge for exactly 1 second. I know. Later. Then it came back. Right now, I need you to tell me if you trust Carla Voss, because she just walked into my Gold Coast location and Roman is about 30 seconds from having her removed. Dante thought about the envelope, about 3 pages in his mother's handwriting. About the last paragraph. Trust her, he said. A pause. Then, all right. Another breath. Then, between the 3 of us, we have maybe 1 chance at this. But it requires you to do something you have never done in your entire career. What? The answer came without hesitation. Ask someone else for help. Asking for help was not a thing Dante Vercelli had done in 20 years of running an organization built on the principle that weakness was the first thing your enemies looked for and the last thing you could afford to show. He had grown up watching his father treat every request for assistance as a ledger entry, something owed, something that would be collected on a timeline of the lender's choosing. He had internalized that lesson so completely that even in the worst operational moments of his career, he had worked the problem internally, with his own people, inside his own structure. He dialed Roman Marlowe's number at 3:47 a.m., standing on a sidewalk in Pilsen, with his breath making small clouds in the cold air. Roman picked up on the second ring with the careful silence of a man who had been awake for hours and was managing several things simultaneously. Your father has the charter, Dante said. No preamble. He used Silas's access to my security network to locate it. I need to know where Matteo is operating from, and I need your organization's surveillance resources to find him before he files the legal challenge. A pause that lasted exactly as long as a man with Roman's discipline allows himself before responding. You're asking me to share Marlowe intelligence resources with a Vercelli. I'm asking you to share resources with the man who just told you your charter location was compromised, when he could have sat on that information and used it differently. Dante's voice stayed flat and even. I'm also the only person in this city who knows Matteo's operational patterns from the inside. You need that. I need your reach. We have maybe 10 hours. Another pause. Come to the Gold Coast location, Roman said. Use the service entrance on the north side. My people will bring you up. A beat. And Vercelli, if this is a positioning move, if you're walking in here to get eyes on our setup, for any reason other than what you've stated, I will find out, and the consequences will be significant. I know, Dante said. I'm coming anyway. The room Roman used as a command center, on the 4th floor of the Gold Coast building, was nothing like what Dante had expected, which said something about what he'd been expecting. He'd anticipated the Marlowe version of what he himself ran a setup that prioritized physical security over everything. All muscle and hardware, and men with guns positioned at intervals. What he walked into was closer to a financial operations center. Banks of monitors running data feeds. 2 analysts working quietly at laptops. A wall-mounted display showing a live city map with active surveillance nodes marked. The violence was present, but it was structured, which meant it was the violence of an organization that had learned the hard way that intelligence wins more engagements than firepower. Roman stood at the map wall, with his coat still on, which meant he hadn't sat down since the charter hit. He looked at Dante when he came in without the hostility Dante had been bracing, for just the focused, evaluative look of a man rapidly recalibrating. Lena was at the table with Carla Voss beside her, and a legal document open between them. She looked up at Dante when he walked in, and the look was brief and containing the kind of look you give someone in an operational context that means we're handling it. Keep moving. Dante went to the map wall and stood next to Roman. What do we have? He said. Matteo Vercelli's current operating location is somewhere in the northwest corridor based on communication signal triangulation, Roman said. We've had a partial trace running for the last 40 minutes. He's moving not stationary, either mobile or rotating through multiple relay points. He won't be stationary, Dante said. He never is when he's running an active operation. He'll have a primary vehicle and 2 alternates rotating through a defined area, and he'll be staying within about a 2-mile radius of wherever he needs to be physically present for the next step. Jizz. The legal filing requires a physical presence at a specific courthouse office. He'll have lawyers on standby, but he needs to be within reach to authorize the submission the moment he judges the timing is right. Dante looked at the map. He'll want to wait until he has confirmation that Elena can't execute a countermove, which means he's watching her location. Roman made a gesture to one of the analysts. Pull the surveillance node grid for the northwestern approaches to this building. Analyst pulled it. The map updated, and Dante scanned the new layer, the positions of cameras, both Marlowe-controlled and public infrastructure, and the gaps between them. The gaps were where Matteo would be. There, Dante said, pointing to a dead zone between 2 coverage areas in a section of streets running parallel to the lake. That's his corridor. He knows this city's surveillance infrastructure. He built most of his operational security around the gaps in it. He'll be in that zone. That's a 12-block area. I can narrow it. Dante pulled out his phone and opened the file Matteo had sent him earlier, the Sarto intelligence document. He sent me this tonight. It has specific approach vectors listed for the operations against Elena's locations. The vectors are all routed from the northwest. He wrote this document. The routing choices will reflect how he moves, not how the Sarto faction moves. He wrote it too naturally to fully separate his own instincts from the operational planning. He went through the document with his finger on the screen, tracking the approach logic. He defaults to elevated positions, parking structures, upper floors. He'll be in something with line of sight to a communication relay point, so he can maintain operational contact. Without using cellular, he doesn't trust cellular when he's active. Roman was watching him work. Something in the older man's expression had shifted slightly. The evaluative quality had not gone away, but it had changed character, from assessment of threat to assessment of asset. There's a parking structure at the north end of that dead zone, one of the analysts said. 7 stories. It has a relay antenna on the roof that services 3 private communication networks. We've had it flagged as a potential position, but didn't prioritize it. Dante and Roman looked at each other. How many men can you put there quietly in 20 minutes? Dante said. 6, Roman said quietly. Do it. But don't move on him. I need to get to him before your people take any action. Roman's expression hardened. That's not how I operate. I know how you operate, and I'm telling you that if your people take Matteo Vercelli into custody before I've spoken to him, he will not tell you where the charter is being held. He'll file the legal challenge from custody and let his lawyers run it out for years. Dante held the older man's gaze. He'll talk to me. Not because we have a good relationship, we don't. Because I have something he wants. What could you possibly have that he wants at this point? Dante glanced at Elena across the room. She was listening, her pen still above the legal document, watching him. He wants me to choose him over her, Dante said. He's been engineering toward that choice for years. He needs to believe he still has a version of that outcome available to him. Or he goes to ground and we lose him entirely. He looked back at Roman. Let me go in first. Give me 15 minutes with him. Roman was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Elena. Elena looked at Dante. Her face was unreadable. In the way he now or indifference, but precision she was processing, calculating, not giving anything away until the calculation was complete. 15 minutes, she said. Roman gave the order. Parking structure was concrete and cold and smelled of exhaust and decades of accumulated grime. Dante went in alone, through the stairwell, with Gio holding position at the ground-level entrance and Roman's 6 men staged at the perimeter. Climbed 7 flights with his hand not on a weapon, because arriving with a weapon drawn would end the conversation before it started. He found Matteo Vercelli on the roof level, standing at the eastern parapet with a phone to his ear. 2 men flanked him, not Sardo people. Private security Dante didn't recognize. They had their hands visible, but their weight shifted. When Dante came through the rooftop door, the automatic repositioning of men calculating angles. Matteo lowered the phone and turned. He was 71 years old, and he looked perhaps 65, which had always been one of his skills. He wore time well, moved with a physicality that the years hadn't quite finished with. His overcoat was dark, his posture straight, and looking at him in the flat pre-dawn light, Dante had the specific, sour experience of seeing yourself in someone and hating the resemblance. You found me faster than I expected, Matteo said. I used the document you sent me, Dante said. Your routing logic gave away your instincts. Something moved across Matteo's face, not quite pride, but the closest he was likely to get to it. I always said you read situations better than any man I trained. Don't. Dante stopped 10 feet away. His 2 guards held position behind him. Don't do the pride thing. Not tonight. Matteo tilted his head slightly. How did you find out about the secondary target listing? Page 41. A pause. I underestimated how carefully you read. Put a contract on me, Dante said. Your own son. I put a contingency on a position, Matteo said, with the flat precision of a man who has spent decades separating persons from functions. If you became a protective vector for Elena Marlowe, rather than a neutral or opposing factor, eliminating that vector became operationally necessary. It wasn't personal. It was a contract on my life. It was a risk management decision. Matteo's voice stayed even. I didn't want it to become necessary. I was hoping you'd stay out of it. You engineered my entire marriage to Elena and then hoped I'd stay out of it. The wind off the lake came across the rooftop and moved between them. Somewhere far below, a siren rose and fell. I made mistakes in how I managed the situation, Matteo said, and the word mistakes came out slightly wrong, like he was using a tool he wasn't fully practiced with. Silas went further than I instructed in some respects. The damage to your marriage was greater than I intended. Greater than you intended, Dante said. You spent 5 years poisoning the one person who was keeping me alive, and the problem was the dosage. Matteo's jaw tightened fractionally. The problem was that I didn't account for how deeply attached you would become to a Marlowe operative. That was a miscalculation. She wasn't an operative. She was my wife. She was both. Matteo's voice sharpened. That's what you still won't fully accept, Dante. She entered your life with a purpose. Whatever she felt for you, and I believe she felt something, I'm not dismissing that she was also executing a function. She was protecting herself and the Marlowe succession by keeping you stable, keeping the Vercelli operation from becoming a destabilizing force. You were managed. I was loved, Dante said. Flat. Certain. And I was too stupid to recognize it, because you spent 5 years making sure I couldn't see it. The 2 men stood on the roof in the cold and the darkness with the city spread out behind them. And for a moment, Matteo just looked at his son with an expression that was complicated in a way that hadn't been there in the earlier phone call. Something that was not quite regret, but was in that territory the look of a man who made choices for reasons that seemed clean at the time, and is only now beginning to understand the shape of what the choices actually were. "Give me the charter," Dante said. "No. The Sardo operation is finished. I had Roman's people move on their primary staging location 20 minutes ago, while you and I were climbing the same building from different sides." This was partially true. Roman had confirmed the Sardo staging disruption as Dante was entering the stairwell. "Your deniable instrument is gone. The legal filing is your last move." "The legal filing is sufficient," Matteo said. "Without the charter, Elena's succession goes into dispute. Years of legal proceedings. In that time you lose," Dante said, "because Elena will run the Marlowe organization informally, regardless of what any legal document says. And you know that. People who follow the Marlowe name will follow her, not a charter dispute. What you get from the filing is noise. Years of expensive noise that doesn't give you what you actually want." He took one step forward. "What do you actually want?" Not the operational answer, the real one. Matteo looked at him for a long moment. "I built something," he said, and his voice shifted, lost its operational precision, became something older. "I built an empire that had your name on it. That was supposed to be what I left. That was supposed to be the thing that lasted." "I know," Dante said. "You're going to walk away from it." The words came out with a flatness that was not quite accusation and not quite grief. "I can see it in how you're standing here. You've already made the decision." "Yes. For her. For myself," Dante said. "She's the reason I could see the decision clearly. That's different." Matteo looked away for the first time out over the dark city. "Your mother said something similar once," he said, and then stopped, like the sentence had gotten away from him. Dante waited. "She said I was so focused on building a legacy that I'd forgotten to build a life." Matteo's voice was careful now, moving around the words like they had edges. "She was right. I knew she was right. It didn't change what I did. I know what you did to her," Dante said. The rooftop went very still. Matteo turned back slowly. "Carla Voss," Dante said, "and the letter Mom left. I read it tonight." Something happened to Matteo Vercelli's face in the next 3 seconds that Dante had never seen before in his life and would not see again. The structure of the man's expression went through, something that looked for just a moment like the face of someone who has been carrying a thing so long they'd forgotten it, had weight until the moment someone named it. Then it closed again, faster than it had opened. "The charter is in a vehicle at the base of this structure," Matteo said. His voice was back to operational. The moment was gone. "Black Suburban, first sublevel. The passenger compartment has a locked document case. My driver has the key." He looked at Dante. "I'm not surrendering. I'm making a calculation. You have the operational terrain, I have a dead instrument, and the math doesn't favor continuing this particular engagement." "That's not enough," Dante said. "I need you to call off whatever secondary Sardo assets are still active." "Done. And I need the financial records. All of them. Everything you've been running through the shadow network. Accounts, routing, the names of the government contacts who've been profiting from the arrangement." Matteo's eyes narrowed. "Those records are worth more than the charter." "I know. That's why I need them." Dante held his ground. "You give me those records. I give you a head start. That's the only offer on the table." A long silence. The lake wind came across the roof again. "How much of a head start?" Matteo said. "Enough." Dante looked at his father and felt the full weight of the word. Enough, what it meant, what it cost, what it didn't fix. "You go where you're going to go. I stop looking. That's all I can give you." Matteo studied him for a moment longer. Then he reached into his coat and removed a phone, which he held out to Dante. "Everything is on a secure partition on this device. The decryption key is your mother's birthday." He paused. "She would have given it to you anyway, eventually. She always intended for you to know the truth." Dante took the phone. He stood there a moment, holding it. "Go," he said. Matteo buttoned his coat, gestured to his 2 men, and walked toward the stairwell on the building's far side. At the door he stopped without turning. "You have her eyes," he said. "Quiet. Your mother's, when you're angry, mainly." Then he went through the door, and the rooftop was empty except for the wind and the distant sound of the city doing its indifferent work below. Dante stood there for 30 seconds. Then he called Roman. "First sublevel. Black Suburban. Get the charter." He pocketed the phone with the financial records and stood at the eastern parapet. His father had just vacated and looked out at the city going gray at its edges as whatever passed for dawn began its reluctant approach over Lake Michigan. His phone buzzed. A message from Elena. Roman has the charter. Carla's drawing up the succession documents now. We can execute the formal declaration in 2 hours. He typed back, I have the financial records. All of them. Government contacts included. A pause. Then, that's going to make a lot of people very nervous. Yes, he typed. That's the point. Another pause. Longer this time. Come down. There's coffee and we have about 90 minutes before this gets complicated again. He looked at the message for a moment. Then he looked back at the city. The Vercelli Empire was already gone. He could feel it. The way you can feel a structure lose its integrity before it visibly falls. The organization he'd built his entire adult life around was about to be handed to federal authorities piece by piece through a set of financial records on a dead man's phone. Everything his father had built, everything Silas had protected, everything that had his name on it in the ledgers of Chicago's criminal infrastructure, all of it ending on a parking structure roof at 5 in the morning while his father walked through a stairwell. He should have felt something enormous. Instead, he felt something much smaller and much harder to name the specific, quiet sensation of a weight being set down after so long, that the absence of it felt strange and slightly wrong. Like the phantom pressure of something that had shaped you by its presence and now had to reshape you by its absence. He turned from the parapet and walked toward the stairwell. One flight down, his phone rang. Harris. He picked up. I need you to hear something before you come back in, Harris said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man delivering news he wishes he were delivering differently. Dante stopped on the landing between the 6th and 7th floor. Silas is gone, Harris said. Whoever had him, they moved him in the last hour. Our surveillance lost the vehicle in the northwest corridor, and we can't reacquire. Dante, if Matteo's people took him back when Matteo was pulling out. They didn't, Dante said, and the certainty of it landed in his chest like something cold. Matteo doesn't need Silas anymore. He gave me what he needed to give me, and he's gone. He gripped the stair railing. Someone else took Silas. Someone who wasn't part of the Matteo operation. A silence. Harris, Dante said slowly, who benefits from having Silas in their custody right now when the charter is back in Marlowe hands. Matteo is gone, and Elena Marlowe is 45 minutes from a legally binding succession declaration. Harris was quiet for 4 seconds. Someone, he said carefully, who wants leverage over the new head of the Marlowe organization before she formally takes power. Dante was already moving back up the stairs toward the roof, where the sight lines were clear and he could think. Find him, he said. Everything we have. Right now. He hit the roof door and came back out into the cold, and the city that had been going gray at its edges was now going pale gold in the east. The first flat light of a winter morning coming off the lake, and somewhere in that city, Silas Creed was in a room with people who understood exactly what he was worth in the next 45 minutes. Dante stood on the roof and ran the logic the way he'd been trained to run it, not from emotion, but from structure, because emotion was what made men sloppy, and sloppiness at this stage would cost something he couldn't afford to lose. Who knew the charter was back in Marlowe hands? Roman's people. Carla Voss, Elena, Harris, the analysts in the Gold Coast command room. The Sardo operation had been disrupted, but not entirely dismantled. There were secondary cells Roman's team hadn't fully mapped, outliers operating on standing orders rather than active command. But that wasn't the right question. The right question was, who knew that Silas, specifically, had value in the next 45 minutes? That required understanding the succession structure, knowing that Silas, as a former senior Vercelli advisor, with documented access to both Vercelli and Marlowe financial architecture, could provide sworn testimony to a federal commercial court that would complicate Elena's succession declaration, even if the charter itself was valid. A competent lawyer with Silas in custody could file an emergency petition within the hour, claiming the succession document had been executed under duress or with compromised counsel. It was thin, but in a legal dispute, thin was enough to create delay, and delay was the only weapon left. Dante called Roman. I need the name of every law firm that has historically done work for competing Eastern families, he said, when Roman answered. Not the Marlows. The families who would lose market position if Elena takes formal control and legitimizes the organization. Roman was quiet for 2 seconds. That's a specific question. Silas has been taken. Whoever has him is going to try to file an emergency sessions challenge through a commercial court before Elena executes the declaration. They need a lawyer who knows the charter structure and a federal venue sympathetic to the challenge. Dante moved along the parapet, keeping his voice low and level. You've been operating in this space for 12 years. You know which firms have been working against Marlowe interests. Give me the names. A longer pause. Then Roman said Hartwell and Crow. They've been retained by the Falcone Financial Group in Detroit for 3 years. The Falcons lose their Eastern brokerage position. The moment Elena takes over, they'd been relying on the Marlowe vacuum to maintain it. Where are they based? Michigan Avenue, 42nd floor of the Aldrin building. Who's their point of contact with the Falcones? A partner named Gresh, Stuart Gresh. He's been the Falcone liaison for 7 years. Dante was already calculating distance. The Aldrin building was 11 minutes from his current position at this hour. Less if he pushed it. Does Elena know about the Falcone exposure? He said. She knows they're an interested party. She doesn't know about Gresh specifically. Tell her. And tell her to slow the succession timeline if she cannot stop it, just by 20 minutes. She's not going to like that. She doesn't have to like it. He ended the call and went back down the stairwell at a run, hitting each landing hard, the concrete cold and slight slick under his shoes. Gio was at the ground-level entrance with 2 of Roman's men, and he read Dante's face before Dante reached him. Car, Dante said. Michigan Avenue now. They made it in 9 minutes. Dante was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped, moving through the Aldrin building's lobby with Gio flanking him, and one of Roman's men taking a position at the entrance. The lobby security desk had 1 guard at this hour, early enough that the building was mostly empty, late enough that the overnight crew was running on its last hour of focus. Dante reached the desk and said a name and a floor number and moved toward the elevators without waiting for a response. And the guard, reading something on his phone and processing the entrance of 3 men in expensive coats with the specific body language of people who do not stop for permissions, made the calculation that most people in his position make and didn't call after them. 42nd floor. The elevator opened onto a carpeted reception area that was dark except for the ambient light coming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Chicago spread below them, gold and gray. In the early morning, Lake Michigan a flat, dark mass beyond. A single office down the corridor had its lights on. Dante walked to it and opened the door without knocking. Stuart Gresh was behind his desk with his jacket on and his phone to his ear, and a document open on his screen that Dante could read from the doorway, a federal commercial court emergency petition, draft watermark still visible in the header. He was in his late 50s, trim, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was professional currency. He looked up when Dante came in, and his expression ran through surprise, calculation, and something close to fear in about 2 seconds, settling finally on a performance of professional composure. He said something into the phone and lowered it. "This is a private office," he said. "You're filing an emergency succession challenge against Elena Marlowe," Dante said. He pulled the chair across from the desk, turned it around, and sat on it backward, with his arms folded across the top. "I need you to tell me where Silas Creed is." Gresh's composure held, but his right hand moved slightly toward the desk drawer, which told Dante 2 things. There was something in the drawer he wanted access to, and he wasn't practiced enough at concealing instincts to keep his hands still under pressure. "I don't know what you're referring to," Gresh said, "and I'd like you to leave before I call building security. You have a draft emergency petition on your screen with Silas Creed listed as the primary witness for a duress claim." Dante nodded toward the monitor. "That means you either have him in custody or you have a commitment from whoever does. I need the location." Gresh straightened. "I'm a lawyer. Whatever you think you know about my client relationships is protected by." "Your client is the Falcone Financial Group," Dante said. "They stand to lose their Eastern brokerage position within 24 hours if Elena Marlowe's succession goes through. That's a motive a first-year prosecutor could explain to a jury in 4 sentences. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not here to threaten you, Mr. Gresh. I'm here because a man's life may be in danger, and the people holding him will have no further use for him the moment you file that petition, or the moment it becomes clear you can't file it. Something shifted in Gresh's face. Not guilt, exactly. Lawyers of his caliber had long since separated their professional mechanics from their personal moral accounting. Something. A recalibration of risk. I was told he was being held voluntarily, Gresh said. Carefully was he. A silence. The contact I dealt with said he'd agreed to provide testimony, Gresh said. Composure was fraying at the edges now, the voice thinning. I was told it was a mutual arrangement. Silas Creed was taken from a surveillance blind spot at 4 in the morning by people running a covert operation, Dante said. Does that sound voluntary to you? Gresh looked at the document on his screen. Then he looked at Dante. I was given an address, he said. A warehouse property on the south branch of the river. I haven't been there personally. My contact was managing the logistics of the witness arrangement. Who's your contact? Gresh wrote a name on a notepad, tore it off, and slid it across the desk without speaking. The gesture of a man who understands he's crossed a line and is now trying to cross back over it in a way that minimizes the visible tracks. Dante picked up the paper, read it, pocketed it. Close the petition, he said. Gresh looked at the screen. Then he highlighted the document and deleted it and emptied the trash folder with 3 clicks. Dante stood, put the chair back where he'd found it, and walked out. He called Harris from the elevator. South branch of the river, warehouse district. I need every property registered to a Falcone-connected entity in that area. Cross-reference with any utility activations in the last 72 hours. Harris had an address in 4 minutes. A warehouse property leased under a logistics company name that traced back through 2 shell layers to a Falcone subsidiary. Harris confirmed a utility activation heat and power 3 days prior, which meant this hadn't been improvised. The Falcone operation had been prepared, running parallel to the Sardo action, ready to deploy the moment the charter situation broke one way or another. They had planned for both outcomes. Dante got back in the car. He checked his watch. 23 minutes before Elena's succession window. Based on the timeline Roman had outlined, Gresh's petition was gone, but there were other lawyers, other venues, other instruments the Falcones could deploy if they had enough time. The only clean solution was Silas out of their custody before they found another mechanism. How many men can we get to that address in 10 minutes? He said to Gio. Our people or Romans both? Gio was on his phone before the sentence finished. The warehouse was a long, low building running parallel to the river with corrugated metal sides that had gone rust orange at the seams and a loading dock on the south face that showed recent vehicle traffic in the frost on the concrete. Dante counted 2 vehicles outside a black SUV and a panel van. He counted 2 visible guards at the loading dock entrance. Roman's intelligence, fed through to Harris and back to Dante in the car, suggested 4 to 6 personnel inside total. He had Gio, 2 of his own men, and 4 of Roman's people. He did not want a firefight. Firefights took time and generated noise and left evidence, and evidence at this stage created complications that would outlast the immediate situation by years. He saw Silas out, the Falcone personnel contained, and the whole thing wrapped before the sun fully cleared the lake. They went in through a side entrance that Roman's people had identified from the building's structural plans, a secondary access door on the east face, padlocked but not alarmed, which one of Roman's men handled in under 40 seconds. With tools Dante didn't look at too closely. Inside's warehouse was cold, despite the utility activation. They'd heated one section, a partitioned area in the northwest corner, marked off by temporary walls that didn't reach the ceiling. Light came from the top of the partition. Voices, low and indistinct. Dante's group moved across the warehouse floor in silence. Concrete was uneven, pooled in places with old water that had frozen and rethawed enough times to turn black. He could hear his own breathing and worked to slow it, not out of fear, out of discipline, the way his body had learned over years to operate at a lower register when the situation required it. They reached the partition. Gio went left. Roman's lead man went right. and Dante went through the gap in the temporary wall, straight ahead. 3 men inside. One was Silas, in a chair, wrists zip-tied to the armrests, a bruise developing on the left side of his face, from what looked like a single blow he'd been hit at some point. Not systematically, more like a warning than a method. He looked exhausted and frightened. And when Dante came through the gap, briefly and completely unmanned, the fear caving into something that wasn't quite relief, but was in that neighborhood. The other 2 were Falcone people, both standing, both reaching when Dante's group entered, and both stopping when they understood the math of the room. On the floor, Gio said, not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. They went to the floor. Dante crouched in front of Silas. He looked at the bruise, the zip ties cutting into the man's wrists, the specific quality of Silas's exhaustion, not just physical, but the deeper kind, the exhaustion of a man who has spent years managing a deception and has spent the last several hours understanding what the deception actually cost. You with me, Dante said. Silas nodded. His voice came out rough. How did you later? Dante gestured to one of Roman's men who cut the zip ties. Can you walk? Yes. Silas stood slowly, working his hands, wincing. He looked at Dante with an expression that had several layers to it, none of them simple. I want to. He stopped. Started again, what I did. I need you to know that I understood, toward the end, what it was, what I'd actually participated in. I know, Dante said. I don't want your forgiveness. I just want you to know that Silas. Dante straightened to his full height. I know. We'll have that conversation later, in a room that isn't a warehouse at 6 in the morning. Right now I need you to walk to the car. Silas walked to the car. They were back at the Gold Coast building at 6:42 a.m. Dante came into the command room and found Elena standing at the table with the succession documents in front of her, Carla Voss beside her, and Roman at the window with his arms crossed, and the look of a man who has spent the last hour deciding to trust a decision he isn't fully comfortable with. Elena looked at Dante when he came in. Then she looked past him at Silas, who had come in behind him and stopped just inside the door. Something moved across her face, the complex recognition of a man who had been used against her for years, now standing in her command room, looking like he'd slept in a warehouse because he had. She looked at Dante. Is it done? She said. Gresh's petition is gone. The Falcone people are contained. Roman's team is handling it. Silas is out. He crossed to the table. You have your window. Elena looked at the documents, at the pen in her hand, at Roman. Roman unfolded his arm and gave a single nod. Elena signed the succession declaration. The room was very quiet. The pen made a small sound against the document. Outside the windows, Chicago was fully in mourning, now pale winter light coming off the lake, the city grinding into its daily motion below them, entirely indifferent to what had just shifted in the legal architecture of one of its most powerful criminal dynasties. Carla Voss countersigned as witness. Roman signed as the outgoing acting head. Elena set the pen down. She didn't look triumphant. She looked, for just a moment, like someone who has been running toward a fixed point for 12 years and has now arrived there. And the arrival is real, but the body hasn't caught up to the fact that it can stop running. She looked, briefly, exhausted and very human, and then she straightened, and the moment passed. She looked at Dante across the table. The financial records, she said. He put the phone on the table, Matteo's phone, the secure partition, with 20 years of shadow network documentation. Government contacts included, he said. 3 sitting officials at minimum, based on what I read in the car. Going to be significant. It's going to be a federal matter, Elena said. Yes. Which means you'll need to decide what your relationship to that process looks like. She held his gaze steadily. What you hand over, what you negotiate. The Vercelli operational records on top of this. I know what it means, Dante said. She waited. I'm going to burn it down, he said. All of it. Every operation, every account, everything with the Vercelli name attached. I'll work with whatever federal process needs to happen to make that clean. He paused. It's already gone, Elena. I just have to finish the paperwork. Roman made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. When Dante looked at him, the old man's expression had something in it that might, in a different man, have been respect. You understand, Roman said, that when this is done, you'll have nothing left of what you built. I'll have what I built on top of what my father handed me, Dante said. Turns out to be less than I thought and also more. I'm still working out the accounting. Elena picked up Matteo's phone and handed it to Carla. Get this to our legal team. We need it processed before anyone, with an interest in those government contacts, figures out it exists. Carla took the phone and left the room. Roman moved away from the window. I'll coordinate the Falcone containment and the federal approach with our legal structure. Elena, we should talk before noon. He moved toward the door, stopped and looked at Dante with the evaluating expression that had been his default setting since Dante had walked in the previous night. You did well, he said. For a Vercelli. It was the most Roman Marlowe had given anyone that morning, and from the way Elena's mouth shifted fractionally at the corner, Dante understood it was probably the most Roman gave anyone, period. Roman left. The command room emptied as the analysts began shutting down the overnight setup, and within 2 minutes, Dante and Elena were alone at the table, with the signed succession document between them and the city coming through the windows in full morning light. Elena sat down in the chair across from him. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at him. Your father got out, she said. Not accusatory, just factual, yes. You let him. I made a calculation. He held her gaze. I can revisit it if you think it was wrong. She considered that. No, she said after a moment. I think you made the only decision that got us to this room, with everything we needed and everyone still breathing. She paused. I just want to understand it. He gave me the records. He gave me the charter location. He called off the remaining Sardo assets. Dante kept his voice even. He's 71 years old, and he's going to spend whatever he has left in looking over his shoulder in whatever totality he finds that's willing to tolerate him. I decided that was sufficient. Elena was quiet for a moment. He killed your mother, she said. I know. The words came out stripped of everything except their basic weight. I know what he did, and I know what giving him a head start cost and what it didn't cost, and I made the decision I could live with. He looked at her directly. Was I wrong? She held his gaze for a long time. No, she said finally. You were human. There's a difference. The room settled into a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, a delivery truck moved along the street below, and a jogger crossed the intersection against the light, and the lake sat flat and gray gold at the edge of everything, doing what it had always done. Dante looked at the succession document on the table between them. What happens now, he said. Elena looked at it, too. Now, I run an organization that's trying to become something different than what it was. Now you dismantle one that was built on something rotten and figure out what was actually yours. She looked up, and somewhere in between all of that, we figure out what we are to each other when there's no war to hold us in the same room. He looked at her. That's going to be a different kind of complicated, he said. Yes, she agreed. It is. And somewhere 3 floors below, in a room Dante didn't know existed, Silas Creed was sitting with a cup of coffee and a Marlowe legal associate who was explaining, in calm and methodical terms, exactly what his cooperation in the coming federal process would look like. While, outside the window, Chicago ran through its indifferent morning, entirely unaware that the architecture of its underworld had just shifted in ways that would take years to fully understand, and that the 2 people most responsible for that shift were sitting at a table on the 4th floor of a Gold Coast building, exhausted and honest with each other, for the first time in 5 years, watching the winter light come off the lake, and not yet talking about what came next, because some silences, after everything, are the only language left that tells the truth. Federal process took 4 months. That was the part nobody told you about. When you decided to burn something down, that the burning itself was slow, administrative, exhausting, in a way that violence never was. Violence was at least honest about what it cost. The federal process cost differently, in hours of deposition, in the specific degradation of sitting across conference tables from prosecutors who were professionally courteous and personally contemptuous, in the paperwork that accumulated in manila folders with his name on the tab, in the moments at 2 in the morning when Dante would sit in the spare apartment he'd moved into on the near north side, nothing like the mansion, nothing like anything he'd owned before, and look at the walls and understand that the life he'd spent 20 years constructing was being disassembled with the same methodical patience that a forensic accountant brings to a balance sheet. He'd kept one lawyer, a woman named Okafor, who had never done criminal defense work in her life. She was a contract specialist, meticulous and unsentimental, recommended by Carla Voss. She understood the specific shape of what Dante was trying to accomplish, which was not a reduced sentence or a favorable plea, but something more structurally complete, a full accounting, voluntarily given, that would hold up to every challenge the government and every surviving interested party could bring against it. She told him in their first meeting that this approach would cost him more in the short term than any negotiated arrangement. He told her that was the point. The mansion sold in the 2nd month. Corporate structures dissolved through the 3rd. The Vercelli name disappeared from operating agreements, from the ownership traces that ran through 6 layers of shell companies in 3 states. Harris, who had been with the organization for 15 years, took a severance and moved to Phoenix, where he had family. Gio retired to a house in Michigan that he'd been paying a mortgage on for a decade without ever living in it. The organization that had carried the Vercelli name dismantled itself with surprisingly little drama, which told Tay something about the difference between loyalty to a person and loyalty to a structure, and what happened to the structure when the person stepped away from it. Silas cooperated fully with federal investigators and provided testimony that, combined with Mateo's financial records, resulted in 3 sealed indictments against sitting officials within the first 60 days. Dante heard about the indictments through Okafor rather than from any news source, because he had stopped watching the news, which was a discipline he maintained, not out of indifference, but out of the understanding that watching the consequences of decisions he'd already made would not change them and might compromise his ability to keep his attention on what was actually in front of him. What was in front of him was mostly Okafor's conference room and his own conscience, which turned out to be more demanding company than he'd budgeted for. He saw Telena twice during 4 months. First time was accidental, or as accidental as anything gets, between 2 people operating in the same city, with overlapping legal circumstances. They were both at the federal building on South Dearborn for separate depositions on the same afternoon. Came out of the elevator, and she was in the lobby, adjusting her coat, her own lawyer beside her, and Roman a half step behind. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. They stood in the federal building lobby for a moment with the foot traffic of the building moving around them. "How's it going?" he said. Slowly, she said. "You?" "Same." Her lawyer said something quietly at her shoulder. She nodded without taking her eyes off Dante. "Carla sends her regards," she said. "Tell her I'm managing. She'll know you said that, and she'll know what it means." He almost smiled. "Yeah." Roman was watching him with the evaluating look that Dante had come to understand was simply Roman's default expression. It didn't mean suspicion, any more than a doctor's clinical gaze meant distrust. It was just how the man processed the world. "Marlowe organization," Dante said, glancing at Roman. "How's the transition?" "Complicated," Roman said. One word offered like a closed door, which was the most Dante expected. Elena buttoned her coat. "I have to go in." She paused. "Are you sleeping?" The question was direct and personal, And she asked it the way she asked operational questions without preamble, with genuine interest in the actual answer. Some, he said. She looked at him for a moment, with the expression he'd spent 5 years misreading. He read it correctly, now it was attention, full and careful. The look of someone who is genuinely taking you in, rather than performing the act of doing so. Take care of yourself, Dante, she said. Then, she walked toward the elevator, and he walked toward the exit, and the federal building lobby closed over the space where they'd stood like water closing over a dropped stone. The second time was deliberate. 6 weeks later, she called him directly, not through Carla, not through Roman's people, just his number, which she still had from the night in the car. I need to tell you something, she said, when he answered. And I want to tell you in person. They met at a coffee place in Wicker Park that neither of them had any history with. She was there before him, at a corner table, no security visible, though he knew Roman's people were somewhere in the block. She had a coffee in front of her, and her hands around it the way she held things when she was thinking, both hands, as if the warmth was something to hold on to. He sat down. She looked at him for a moment without starting. The Falcone group has been indicted, she said. All 3 senior principals. The financial documentation from your father's records was the primary basis. It went through yesterday. I know. Okafor told me. There's something Okafor doesn't know yet. Elena set her coffee cup down. One of the 3 Falcone principals, before the indictment was formally filed, attempted to negotiate with federal investigators by offering additional information about a related matter. She paused. The information concerned your mother's death. Dante went very still. He offered documentation, Elena said carefully, showing that the arrangement Matteo used to manage the situation, the one your mother discovered, included a payment to a medical professional who falsified the initial cause of death determination. The documentation was authenticated yesterday. Coffee place noise continued around them, the hiss of an espresso machine, a conversation at the next table about something entirely ordinary. The door opening and closing on the cold street outside. So it's on record, Dante said. It's on record. It will be part of the formal proceedings. Elena's voice was steady, but her eyes were careful on him, watching his face the way she'd watched it in the car that night, outside her Gold Coast building with full attention, not managing, just present. I wanted you to hear it from me rather than from a filing. He nodded once. He looked at the table. He thought about a letter in his mother's handwriting, 3 pages, the last paragraph. Thought about what it meant to have a thing confirmed that you already knew to be true, that the knowing had not required the confirmation, but that the confirmation changed the weight of the knowing in some way he didn't have precise language for. Thank you, he said. Elena looked at him. How are you actually? I'm actually, he stopped. Tried again. I'm learning how to be still, which I'm not good at. No, she agreed. You're not. I've been doing some things. Okafor has a contact at a legal aid organization that works with people trying to exit criminal infrastructure, connecting them with legitimate work, process after records, that kind of thing. I've been consulting for them, informally. He said it the way you say things that feel slightly exposed. I know the architecture of how those systems work from the inside. It turns out that's useful from the outside. Elena was quiet for a moment. Your mother would have liked that, she said. He looked at her. Don't. I mean it. She talked about what you were capable of when you weren't inside the thing your father built. She talked about it a lot in what she wrote. She held his gaze. I read everything she left with Carla. She asked Carla to let me read it, if the situation ever reached a point where it was relevant. A pause. She knew, Dante. She knew who you were underneath the organization. She was waiting for you to find out. He held that for a moment. You've known about my mother for a long time, he said. And you never, I couldn't, tell you without everything else coming apart before we were positioned to handle it. She shook her head slightly, and for the first time in the conversation, something that wasn't entirely composed came through, a tiredness, old and specific. I made choices about what to protect and when. I stand by the logic. I don't entirely stand by what the logic cost. The marriage. The marriage. The distance. She looked at her coffee. The years of you thinking I didn't. She stopped. I was always there, Dante. I was always completely there. I just couldn't show you the whole map. The espresso machine hissed. The door opened. Cold air moved through the room and closed again. I know, he said. I need you to actually know it, she said. Not just say it. I know, he said again differently. I've had 4 months of very long nights to understand the difference between what I thought I was seeing and what was actually in front of me. I know. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee and drank some of it, and something in her shoulders settled fractionally. The specific relaxation of someone who has been braced for a conversation and found it was survivable. The Marlowe organization, she said, shifting. The legitimization process is going to take another 18 months minimum. Roman is managing the transition well, but he's tired. He's been holding that structure together for 12 years on borrowed authority, and he's ready to actually rest. Is he okay? He's fine. He's just finished, in the way people get finished when the thing they were waiting for finally arrives. She turned the cup in her hands. I'm building something different than what it was. Financial and security infrastructure that can stand daylight. Complicated, because there are people inside the organization who want the old model and people outside who want us to fail because a legitimate Marlowe organization changes the market structure they've been operating in. Every week there's a new friction point. Sounds exhausting. The most interesting thing I've ever done, she said, and the flatness of it, the complete absence of performance in the statement, made it more convincing than any enthusiasm would have been. Dante looked at her. I'm glad. She looked back at him. I know. They sat in the Wicker Park coffee place for another 20 minutes talking about things that were smaller than everything they'd been talking about. And it was in those 20 minutes that Dante understood something he hadn't quite been able to articulate since the courthouse, that what he felt for Elena Marlowe was not the version of feeling that required her to be present in order to exist. It was the kind that had simply become structural, built into how he processed the world, not going anywhere, regardless of what form the future took, clarifying, not in a way that made it easy, just in a way that made it true. She left first. She put on her coat and picked up her bag and paused at the edge of the table. I'll be in touch, she said, about the legal aid consulting. There may be a more formal arrangement that makes sense. The Marlowe legal structure is looking at some affiliated work in the same space. He looked up at her. Is that the real reason you're mentioning it? She held his gaze. It's a real reason, she said. It's not the only one. Then she walked out, and through the window, he watched her move along the sidewalk in the winter cold. Roman's people materializing naturally around her from the parked cars and doorways they'd been occupying without visible effort. The whole quiet machinery of her security apparatus folding around her the way it had been designed to, and she moved through all of it with the specific ease of someone who has accepted the shape of their life and is no longer fighting the parts that are simply true. Finished his coffee. Silas Creed's formal testimony was completed in the 3rd month, and his cooperation agreement was finalized in the 4th. He received a reduced sentence on a federal conspiracy charge and would serve it at a minimum security facility in Wisconsin. Dante visited him once, the week before sentencing, in a conference room at his lawyer's office. They sat across from each other in the conference room, and Dante looked at the man who had spent 8 years as his most trusted advisor and had spent 5 of those years systematically dismantling his marriage at his father's direction, and tried to organize what he felt about that into something coherent. It resisted organization. It was neither forgiveness nor its opposite. It was something more like the accurate understanding of how a thing had happened, stripped of the need to assign it a final moral position. I have a question, Dante said. Silas nodded. The argument about the Donnelly contract, the one that lasted 6 days. Dante watched Silas's face. Was any part of that her position? Was she actually right? Silas was quiet for a moment. She was entirely right, he said. Donnelly had federal exposure that would have created significant problems for 3 of your operations within 18 months. She had identified it correctly, and her recommendation was sound. He looked at his hands. I told you she was trying to undermine your judgment. She was trying to protect your operation. Dante nodded. She tried to tell you directly once, Silas said. You walked out of the room. I had told you the previous week that she'd been asking questions about the Donnelly arrangement that suggested she was feeding information to a competing interest, primed to misread it. I know. I'm not. Silas stopped. I'm not telling you that to manage your perception of what I did. I'm telling you because you asked, and the complete answer matters. Yeah, Dante said. It does. He stood up. He put on his coat. He looked at Silas for a moment, the man's age, his tiredness, the quality of his remorse, which was real, even if it was insufficient. Do the time clean, Dante said. Whatever comes after, do it differently. He walked out. In the 5th month, the last of the formal Vercelli dissolution paperwork was filed and processed. Okafor called him on a Thursday morning to confirm, and the call lasted 4 minutes. And when it was over, Dante sat in his near North Side apartment and understood that the thing he had been in the world for 20 years was now entirely finished. The apartment had 3 rooms and a window that looked out over a section of the city that had no particular significance. He'd furnished it slowly, buying things one at a time when he needed them, rather than acquiring a complete life all at once, which was how he'd done everything before, completely, all at once, as if incompleteness was a form of vulnerability. The result was a place that felt unfinished in a way that he'd initially found uncomfortable and had come to find more honest. He made coffee in the kitchen and stood at the window and looked at the city, doing its ordinary work in the ordinary morning, and he thought about his mother's last paragraph, about the instinct to control everything being his father's, not his, about being better than he was. He thought about whether that was true. He'd spent 5 months examining the evidence with the specific attention of a man who has had every comfortable self-narrative stripped away and has to start from what's actually there. The evidence was mixed. He had done significant damage in his life, to people, to structures, to the woman. Spent 5 years failing to see clearly. He had also, when the critical moments arrived, made different choices than his father would have made. He had let Matteo go, which was not virtue exactly, but was something. He had handed the financial records over completely, which cost him more than any negotiated arrangement would have. He had visited Silas and asked a question that didn't serve him and sat with the answer. He did not know if that constituted being better. He knew it constituted being different. He was going to have to decide whether different was enough to build something on, and that was going to take more than 5 months to determine. His phone buzzed. A message from Elena. The legal aid organization wants to formalize the consulting arrangement. Okafor has the details. Also, there's something I want to show you. Not urgent. When you have an afternoon. He looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed back, "This week works. You pick." She sent back a time and an address. He didn't recognize the address. He looked it up and found it was a building in the West Loop, converted industrial space, 3 years into a renovation, operating as a mixed-use financial and community services center. The Marlowe legal structure was listed as the primary developer. He typed, "What is it?" Her response came back quickly, "Something I've been building. I want someone who understands what it used to be to see what it's becoming." He set the phone down on the kitchen counter and picked up his coffee and stood at the window and looked at Chicago in its morning indifference. Somewhere across the city, Matteo Vercelli was in whatever city he'd found that was willing to tolerate him, carrying the weight of what he'd built and destroyed. getting older in the way that men who have never learned stillness get older restlessly, incompletely. He would not surface. The financial records had made him too exposed, too traceable, too dependent on staying invisible. He was done, not in the clean way that endings in Dante's former world were usually done, but in the slower, quieter way that was its own kind of sentence. Roman Marlowe had retired to a property in Connecticut 3 weeks after the succession declaration was finalized. He'd called Dante once, brief and businesslike, to confirm that the Eastern legal structures were in order and that Elena had everything she needed. At the end of the call, he'd said, "You did right by her when it mattered." Then he'd hung up. It was the most complete approval Dante had ever received from a man he had no obligation to impress, and it sat with him differently because of that. The morning moved at its ordinary pace, a delivery truck below. Someone walking a dog, the city's indifferent machinery turning over, producing the same ordinary Friday it produced every Friday, in complete ignorance of all the things that had shifted in its architecture over the past 5 months. Dante finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, put his coat on. He had a meeting with the legal aid organization at 10, not a consulting call, an actual meeting in their actual office with the actual people doing the work. He'd been doing this for 2 months, and each time the meeting ran longer than scheduled because the questions they needed were more complex than the hour they'd booked. And he always stayed because the work was genuinely difficult and genuinely mattered. And those two things together were something he had not experienced in a very long time. He picked up his keys, looked at the apartment, the 3 rooms, the window, the unfinished quality that was becoming familiar in the way that honest things become familiar. He thought about Elena's message, about a building in the West Loop that used to be one thing and was becoming another, about someone who understood what it used to be, being invited to see what it was becoming. He locked the door and went down to the street. The cold hit him when he came out of the building, the specific Chicago cold that came off the lake and moved through everything without apology. He turned up his collar and started walking because the meeting was 12 blocks, and he had time, and walking had become something he did, now moving through the city at its own pace, at ground level, without the buffer of a car or security, or the careful management of who saw him and where. Just a man on a sidewalk in a city going about its morning. He passed a woman walking with a small child who was very interested in a crack in the sidewalk. He passed 2 men arguing about something outside a coffee shop, their voices loud and entirely local in the way that arguments about small things always are. He passed a construction site where someone had written something in the concrete of the freshly poured curb illegible by the time he reached it, just marks made by someone who wanted to leave evidence they'd been there. He thought about what his mother had written, about the woman who could match him, about trust over control. He thought about Elena Marlowe signing the divorce papers in a courthouse at 2 a.m. with the specific calm of someone executing a plan she'd been building for years, saying, "You finally gave me exactly what I needed," and how the sentence had felt like betrayal when he heard it and felt, now, like the most honest thing anyone had said to him in 5 years. She had needed the legal exit. She had needed the space. She had needed him to stop being the thing she was protecting and start being the person he was capable of being. And she had created the conditions for that with the same quiet, complete intelligence she brought to everything. He had been furious at her for it. He was no longer furious. What he was instead was something he was still finding language for, a combination of gratitude and grief. And the forward-facing version of both of those things that didn't have a single clean word, but was probably, in the end, just what it meant to be changed by something real. The legal aid office was on the 2nd floor of a building near the river. He was 3 minutes early. He went in and walked up the stairs and into the office, where 2 people were already seated around a table with coffee and a stack of case files, and a third was at the window, on a call, and they all looked up when he came in, and one of them said, "You're actually early," with genuine surprise, and he pulled out a chair and sat down and said, "Let's get to it." And they did. The work was not glamorous, and it was not finished, and it would not be finished for a very long time, if ever. That was what made it real. He had spent 20 years in a world where power expressed itself in finality, in things that were definitively over, definitively controlled, definitively won. The work in front of him now had no such qualities. It was ongoing, resistant, full of complications that resolved into new complications. The people it served were complicated and imperfect, and not always grateful, and not always helped by his help, and none of that was a reason to stop. His phone sat in his pocket and did not buzz, because Elena Marlowe was running a legitimate organization in a West Loop building, and did not need to contact him until she chose to, and she would choose to on Thursday afternoon, at a time she had specified, and he would go, and they would stand in a building that used to be one thing, and was becoming another, and they would look at it together. That was what came next. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the first thing in a long time that had felt like it actually belonged to him, built from what remained after everything his father had handed him was finally, completely given back.